Good morning. It's wonderful to see the size of the crowd this morning. This is terrific. Maybe that glimpse of sunshine out there got you here. For once, we didn't have to dodge raindrops or potential snowflakes that I'm hearing on the radio newscast forecast. I know many of you are planning to move to warmer climates in the next couple of months, and for some of you, this may be your last meeting until spring. We wish you safe travels and look forward to seeing you when you return. This morning, we have 16 guests or visitors with us. If you are a guest or visitor, would you just stand where you are so we can give you a HASP welcome? Thank you. I'd also like to introduce 8 new HASP members. And if you would just stand wherever you are seated, turn around so we can get a good look at you, that would be great. First of all, Wilbur Daniels, Joyce Elferink, and Joyce is being reinstated. It's wonderful to have you back, Joyce. Dale Kramer, Nancy Martin, Emil Pulak, Kay Smalley, Charlie Soria, and Cynthia Vanderwood. Welcome to HASP.
Thank you, Carla. Claudia Berry, our monthly program chairperson, will now introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Larry. The higher education landscape is undergoing unprecedented change. The rapid shifts in technology, demographics, economics, and nature of work present new challenges and opportunities for colleges and universities to reimagine the ways in which graduates are prepared for the workforce. How will Hope College thrive in this new and exciting future? Today, Matt Scogin, Hope College President, will share his perspective on the future of education and work. Matt is the 14th president of Hope College. He was elected by the Board of Trustees on December 7, 2018, and assumed office on July 1, 2019. Previously, President Scogin served as Chief Administrative Officer at the global financial advisory firm of Perella Weinberg Partners in New York City. He also held leadership positions at the New York Stock Exchange and the U.S. Treasury Department. Matt himself will admit that his career path was not the trajectory through academia that one would typically culminate in a college presidency. However, his experience as an innovative leader, coupled with a passion and a vision for hope, made him a clear choice to lead the college. He majored in political science and economics and Hope, and has a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. After finishing graduate school, he spent time in Germany as a fellow with the Robert Bosch Foundation studying on employment and labor market policy. Matt and his wife, Sarah, have 3 children, and they all look forward to having a long tenure at Hope. Please join me in welcoming President Matt Scogin.
Well, Thank you so much for being here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it's great to be with all of you. We were talking a little bit with some of my colleagues just before this started, and what's interesting is this room holds about 700 to 800 people, and it's nearly full, at least the bottom floor of it. And what's cool about that is that that means this group is almost the same size as one of our classes at Hope. So we have the freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and I think maybe we should rename HASP our fifth-year seniors. Which is kind of cool. So I've been slowly meeting all of our students, and I haven't met all of them yet, but it's great to meet all of you, at least in a group setting, and I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces, so thank you for having me. HASP is a great program. I'm really proud of this program, and I know that Hope as an institution is really proud of this program too. So thank you for being here, thank you for being a part of HASP, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to try to not take the whole time. I'm at the stage of my job where I'm trying to do more listening than talking, and so I'd love to leave ample time for questions and for conversation. So my plan is to hopefully leave at least 15, 20 minutes to do that. I want to give you a sense of just kind of my early priorities and how I'm spending my time. I just hit 4 months into the job on Friday. November 1st was my 4-month anniversary. So starting to get into a rhythm and starting to get my legs underneath me. And so I'll give you a sense of kind of how I've been spending my time, and that'll just be a few minutes. And then, as you heard, what I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about this morning is kind of looking at higher education and how I think it's changing and how I think we at Hope can be thinking about that into the future. The first thing I'll just say is that this job, stepping into this role, has been such a joy and such a privilege for me. I always say that I just feel such a sense of fullness, and clearly my calendar has been full. It's been very, very busy, but my heart is full also, and I do have such a deep sense of optimism and hope for the future of our institution. And I don't say that delusionally. I know that there are real challenges. I know that the institution has been through a series of challenges over the last few years, and leadership changes at the top and things that went on last year. So I know that there are real challenges. So I don't say that I'm full of a sense of optimism and hope delusionally, but I do say it soaked in hours of prayer. And the one thing that I've come away with after hours and hours of prayer for this institution is a deep sense that I believe God's plans for our little school are very big. And I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about what some of those big plans might be. But it's been such a joy. It's been such a joy to be here. I find myself waking up every morning and just pinching myself, saying, I hope this isn't a dream. I hope this is really my life. And so far, 4 months into it, it's still real, which is amazing. So, as I said, first thing I want to do is just give you a sense of how I'm spending my time, my early priorities into the job, and then we'll use that to feed into a bigger conversation about some of the big exogenous changes that I see going on in higher education and how we might think about that here at Hope College. First thing I've been doing, and I alluded to this, is I'm just spending a lot of time meeting people and listening and learning. And this is fun. I love people. So it's been fun to meet people who love Hope like I do and who care about this institution very much. So I've been kind of slowly working my way through. You think about Hope in concentric circles, and there are a lot of stakeholders. There are a lot of people who love Hope. I've been meeting, it's going to take some time, but I've been meeting one-on-one with every single member of our faculty. So we have 274 full-time members of the faculty, and I'm about, I've lost track, but I'm somewhere between 35 and 40 of them, of those meetings I've had. So I've got a ways to go, and I know that, and it'll probably take me a year and a half to get through all of them. But it's been fun, and what I've been doing is I've been going to their offices and sitting in their space and looking at the pictures on their walls and just getting to know them as people. And some people have said, well, maybe you should just go to department meetings and then you can meet everybody that way through group settings. And the answer is yes, I'll do that also. And I do need to go to department meetings and hear what's on the minds of departments collectively. But I want to get to know the people also. And so that's what I've been doing, is spending time getting to know our faculty. I've been going to all the staff meetings of all our staff. We have about 500 full-time staff who work at Hope, and so I've been meeting, that group is, since it's bigger, that group I have been meeting in group settings. And then I've been going to all the first-year seminars. So we have about 40 first-year seminars, and I've hit 24 of them so far. And so I drop in for one of their classes, and what that allows me to do is it allows me, our first-year seminars are roughly between, kind of 18 to 20 students, and that allows me to meet all of our first-year students, at least in a relatively small group setting. And that's been fun, and what I'll do is continue that every year so that 4 years from now I will have met, at least in a small group setting, every single one of our 3,000 students on campus. So that's been great, meeting faculty, meeting staff, meeting students. And then I've also been working my way through some of our external stakeholders. Jeff Puckett is here. When I first got here, I asked Jeff for a list of our top 25 donors, and I've met 21 of our top 25 donors so far, and then kind of working my way through some of our other strategic relationships outside of Hope College in Holland. So that's been great. We're also starting to do some, we're calling them welcome tour visits. So we have our first one in Detroit tomorrow in Bloomfield Hills, and we have over 200 people signed up to attend an event tomorrow night in Detroit, which is great. We have one in Grand Rapids coming up in a few weeks, and then in the spring we're going to do a series of cities around the country where Hope has a concentration of alumni and supporters. So that's kind of the first thing, just meeting people, listening, learning, and hearing what's on folks' minds when it comes to Hope College. Second thing, more from an operational perspective, is the most important thing we've been focused on as a leadership team, and the most important thing I've been focused on, is simply admissions. And I'll talk a bit more about this later on, but admissions, I think, from a tactical perspective, from an operational perspective, is our single biggest issue that we need to think about strategically. As you may know some of these numbers, we've been targeting a class size of around 800. 775 is our budget break-even number. This year's freshman class came in at 728, which left us with about a $2 million budget gap for this year. And so we're working really hard to try to catch up and come up with a number for next year's class that's closer to that 800 range. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about admissions. The other thing, and I've been talking a lot about this internally, and my vernacular is health before growth. And what I'm talking about here is the whole idea of before we grow as an institution, and I do have big growth ambitions for Hope, and I will talk about that in a second. But before we rush toward our big growth ambitions, I want us as an institution to be really healthy internally. And part of that means kind of healing from what's the institution has been through over the last few years, leadership changes and things like that. So I want us to feel like we have some sense of healing from what's happened at the institution the last few years. And I also want, some of it I think is even deeper than what's happened the last few years. And we as a college, as an institution, have been trying to move the needle when it comes to diversity and inclusion for more than 3 decades. And we've made slow incremental progress. But the question is there something about our culture that's holding us back from really making more dramatic progress in that area? So we're spending a lot of time talking about our culture. The whole idea of health before growth, I think it has 2 big pillars, and there's a lot of other more ancillary things, but 2 big things that we're working on in this area. One is a review of our policies and procedures. And this was something that came out of what happened last year with the music department, is we're taking a hard look at our faculty handbook, we're taking a hard look at our governance structure. And we're just saying, what did we learn last year, and what kind of governance structure can best serve our institution in the future. And so we're taking a hard look at our policies and procedures. I also think, in parallel to that, and I actually think this is even more important than our policies and procedures, but in parallel to that, we have a whole project on our culture. And we have a group called the Culture Task Force that we convened. They've met 2 or 3 times already. And this is a group that's looking at our culture. And my own view is that it's one thing to have policies and procedures on writing, but it's a whole other thing to have the real culture, the culture of an institution that lives and breathes in the hallways, that lives in the conference rooms, that lives in the Pine Grove. And so what we're looking at here is first step is, what would we like our culture to be? What do we want? When you say the culture of Hope College is X, what would you like X to be? How would you like to fill that in? That's the first step, is just to define the aspiration. What do we want our culture to look like in the future? Second step is then to do an audit of what do we think our culture is today. And then, of course, the hardest part is how do you bridge that, how do you go from where we are today to where we'd like to be? And so we have a group that's working really hard on that project, Culture Task Force. So there's a lot there that we can talk about if you wish, but this has been my biggest theme for internal conversations at Hope over the course of the last 4 months, is this whole idea of health before growth, and how do we really have a culture that feels healthy? How do we have a culture where we can disagree without being divided? That, by the way, is the thing the country can't figure out right now. I desperately want Hope to be in a position where we can at least be taking steps toward that kind of environment that the country is not taking. And I think we can do it. I think we can do it, but it's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take, I desperately want Hope to be a place where we can, as individuals, we can take convictions, but then we go out of our way to love others and to make allowances for others who hold different convictions. And that, I think, it can be a very, very powerful thing. And if we're talking about, how do you put hope on the map? How do you really exude hope into the world? That, I think, is the most important thing we can do. If we can have a culture where we can disagree without being divided, in some ways, that's the thing that could be a defining, distinctive aspect of our institution. So, obviously, a lot more there we can talk about, but I want to keep moving. Health before growth is kind of the biggest thing I've been talking about internally. And then when it comes to long-term vision casting for the institution, I've been talking about long-term vision in three big buckets, three big focus areas. And these are the areas that I would love for Hope to be focused on long-term. We have a great strategic plan. As you may know, it's called Hope for the World 2025. We're in year 5 of that plan, so we're halfway through our 10-year plan. And I think that's great. That gives us a roadmap for what the next 5 years will look like. But what I'm talking about here is what's beyond that. What's the 10 to 15-year vision for our institution? And I think if we can have robust conversations in these three areas, we'll be really well positioned for the long-term future. And I'm at the stage of my job now where I'm posing more questions than answers. What I'm simply doing is saying, these are the conversations that I want us as an institution to be having. And so the three big areas that I've been saying, these are the conversations I want us to be having, is 1, the future of learning. 2 is the future of work, meaning the future of the workplace. And 3 is the future business model of higher education. So I'll spend a minute or two on each of those, and then the one we're going to mainly talk about this morning is the future business model of higher education. Future of learning, I think, is a really fun conversation. What I'm talking about there is kind of the classroom. What should the classroom of the future look like at Hope? And there I think we can break that down into 3 big conversations around learning. One is, what are we learning? What are we teaching at Hope? We're in the early stages of a review of our core curriculum at Hope College. It's the first time we've done this in 25 years, so we're taking a look at the core curriculum of a Hope College liberal arts degree and saying, what do we want that to entail? What do we want a Hope College liberal arts education to embody? I think this is an exciting opportunity, and what I think it provides us is it gives us a chance to say, we don't want to just offer liberal arts at Hope College. We want to offer a special flavor of liberal arts, something distinctive. There are thousands of places where you can go and get liberal arts. We ought to be able to say that when you come to Hope College, you don't just get liberal arts, you get Hope College liberal arts, some kind of special brand, some kind of special flavor, something distinctive about what we're offering in liberal arts. So we're taking a look at what we're teaching. I think there's another conversation around tools of learning. How do you learn? How should technology change or not change what we're doing in the classroom? And there, I just want to be having the conversation. It could very well be that we as an institution decides that as the world goes high-tech, we deliberately take the other direction and go high-touch. I don't know, but I want us to be having that conversation. And I'll show you some numbers in a minute on how online learning is real, and it's a real competitor now. And I think for a long time, institutions like ours have basically ignored online learning and said, well, that's not real education, that's not a real competitor. And the problem is they're stealing our students now, so we have to pay attention to online learning. The third thing under learning is who's teaching, who's learning, who are we teaching? And there, what's amazing, and when you look at national statistics on who's taking a college course in the United States today it's the case, today, 2019, that 45% of people who are enrolled in a college class in the United States today are older than 22 years old. So there's this old notion of college as being something that serves 18 to 22-year-olds. Well, today it's the case that almost half of college students in the United States today are older than 22 years old. Look at this room. I think Hope, I'm really proud of this. Hope is more than 3 decades into this project of lifelong learning. The whole country now is catching up to this. But Hope has taken a first step long before a lot of other institutions did. And so I'm proud of HASP for that reason. I think HASP provides a great model for what we might think about for I think we could scale this and do more with it, to be honest. So there's a lot we can talk about there, but that's kind of how I think about future of learning. What are we learning? What are the tools of learning? And then who's learning? Who are we teaching? Future of the workplace. you all know this, so I don't need to emphasize it, but the workplace is changing at such a rapid pace. And I just want Hope to be thinking about that. I want Hope to be having the conversation, how are we connecting the classroom experience to the rapidly changing workplace? And there, I actually think liberal arts is in such a powerful position to be the thing that the working world of the future needs. There's amazing research coming out now, and there's been this huge, over the last 2 decades, there's been this huge public policy push around STEM education. And what the current research is showing is that actually STEM-only jobs are declining as our share of our labor force. It turns out STEM-only jobs are often the first jobs and the easiest jobs to automate. What's growing as a share of our labor force is jobs that have some STEM skills and some social skills, some STEM, some humanities. And those jobs are growing at a really rapid pace. So jobs like nursing, where there's some technical aspect to the job, but there's also a very human aspect to the job. That, I think, is a powerful indicator of what the workplace actually needs, which is liberal arts, this broad base of knowledge rather than a narrow but deep base of knowledge. So I think we're really well positioned for the future of the workplace, but I want to be having the conversation, and I want to be working deliberately to connect our classroom experience to the working world. We have this, you've probably heard about the Borchter Center. We're a year into it now. It's going really well, and it's a cool thing, where we've taken what used to be just a career services office, and we're doing so much more with it. And there again, I think Hope is, just like with HASP, Hope saw this coming, and we've taken a step to be kind of on the leading edge of this conversation about connecting liberal arts to the working world. So that's future of learning, future of work. The future business model of higher education is the one that we're going to spend the most of our time talking about now, and that's the one that I've made some headlines on, given things I said in the inauguration speech a few weeks ago. And so I want to just spend the bulk of our time there talking about the business model, and then for questions we can go back and talk about whatever's on your mind. So I just want to have 3 quick sections to this business model conversation. First of all, we'll set the stage and look at why is our business model under pressure. Then we'll look at what we can do about it longer term, and then how we get from here to there. First thing, in terms of setting the stage, I want to just point out 3 things, and some of these are obvious to a lot of you, but sometimes it's worth pointing out the obvious. The first thing that's true in higher education, and coming from a background outside of higher education, I see this very palpably here in higher education. And one thing that's just true generally in higher education is that there's no natural constituency in higher ed that pushes for cost control. So I don't know if you can see this. This is national data for the last 15 years. The top line, the blue bars, show revenue. This is, in other words, revenue across all of higher education in the country. And the bottom line, the orange bars, show expenses. And so what you see on the top line is that the revenue line is very bumpy. It goes up, then it goes down during the financial crisis, then it goes back up, then it goes down a little bit, then it goes up, and then it's more or less flat for the last 3 or 4 years. So the revenue line is bumpy. It's up and down. The expense line on the bottom is not bumpy. It's very, very linear. It just goes up every single year, regardless of what's happening to the revenue line. And so if anybody comes from the business world, you know that that doesn't make sense long term, and that is a trajectory that's unsustainable. You can't have revenue lines that's bumpy when the expense just goes up every single year. And when you think about it nationally, institutions of higher learning have 3 big constituencies: the students, the faculty, and the board. And as I've observed it, what's happened with those 3 constituencies is that those 3 constituencies actually are pushing the costs higher. And there isn't a natural constituency who's saying, let's try to keep the costs lower. Students, on one hand, will say, yes, we want lower tuition. Yes, we want this to be more affordable. And yet, on the other hand, they'll say, we want nicer dorms, we want nicer dining halls, we want more sports, we want more programs, we want more amenities. So students are pushing costs higher. And to the extent that higher education views students as customers, which I think is problematic, I think it's problematic to view students as customers, but historically that's been the case, and to the extent the customer is always right, higher education, for the most part, has said, you want it, you got it, and so we'll give it to you. Faculty, in the same vein, faculty will say, yes, we want higher education to be more affordable. Yes, we want this to be more accessible. But faculty will also push for, we want more programs, we want more majors, we want academic independence, which often means budgetary independence. And so faculty will similarly be saying yes on one hand, but on the other hand, kind of pushing costs higher. And boards, in the same way, you look at conversations that boards of institutions of higher learning are having around the country today, and boards this should be the constituency that says, let's try to keep costs down. Boards, what they're really talking about around the country is competitiveness. How do we make our institution more competitive? And that often means new buildings, new sports facilities, new programs, new stuff that's expensive. And so everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction here, which is pushing costs higher on one hand, and on the other hand, there's real pressure on revenue. And that just makes the model unsustainable long term. That's the first observation. Second observation is that funding for scholarships is highly dependent on students who are here now. And this is true at Hope, and this is true at other places. And I want to show you what this looks like. I know I'm going to lose some of you here. So if this doesn't resonate with you, sorry. We can talk about something else in Q&A. But if you think about Hope having a demand curve. So I was an economics major at Hope. So sorry about this. Let's say that this is Hope's demand curve, and on the bottom you have number of students, and on the vertical axis you have the price, tuition, room, and board. So if we say we want 800 students at Hope, the market clearing price for that we think is around $30,000 a year. That's roughly the average price that students pay to come to Hope. The average price that students pay is roughly around $30,000. So this demand curve then has two problems. One problem is that there are families up here who are willing to pay more to come to Hope. And there's families down here who we want to have at Hope, but they can't afford that market clearing price. So what do? We set the price at the top of the demand curve, which is roughly $46,000 a year. That's what we charge to come to Hope College. We know that that's the top of the demand curve because we only get about 7% of our students to pay that price. So we get about 50 out of a class of 800 to pay the full sticker price, tuition, room, and board. And then what happens is anybody who's paying a price higher than the $30,000 market clearing price is paying for their own education and for part of somebody else's education. So what you have is essentially, it's sort of like Social Security. You have a pay-as-you-go system where the way we're funding scholarships for the people who can't afford the $30,000 is by charging other students more than they actually need to pay to come to Hope. So they're paying for their own education and for part of somebody else's. So that means that our scholarship budget, 78% of the scholarships that we offer at Hope College are paid for by other students who are here right now at Hope College. They're living in the dorms, they're eating in the dining halls. They're paying for scholarships for somebody else. And only 9% of our scholarships are coming from our endowment drop. That's why this is a pay-as-you-go system. It's just like Social Security. The only way Social Security gets paid benefits out is to have current people paying into it. It's a pay-as-you-go system. And that's what's happened at Hope. That's what's happened all throughout higher education, where the only way we can offer scholarships is by charging some students a lot more than they would need to pay so that they can pay for their own education and part of somebody else's. And then this just shows that, this compares national data to Hope College. It shows that 78% of our scholarships come from student revenue, whereas 9% comes from the endowment. And we're just a little bit off compared to national data. National data shows that 60% of student revenue comes from tuition, room, and board, whereas on average 25% comes from the endowment, which means that our endowment's too small. So you can't see all of this, but this is, Hope is the orange bar there. This is our endowment per student. And this just shows that our endowment's too small per student. And when you compare us to our peer group, only Calvin has a smaller endowment than we do. And Hope has done an amazing job, a remarkable job of raising money for buildings. And this one is a great example of that. We have amazing facilities here now. And I think the only criticism of what's been done in the past is that we haven't done as good a job of raising money for programs and raising money for the endowment. And so that's my focus going into the future, is to have a bigger endowment so that we can move out of this sort of pay-as-you-go system for scholarships. The third thing that I want to highlight in terms of why is our business model under pressure is that there's more competition. And again, this will be obvious to you, so I can move through this quickly, but this is what I highlighted with regard to online learning. So four-year institutions like ours are not the only game in town anymore to show an employer that you're ready for work. This is national data. You see the most recent year for which data is available is 2017. So there's around 20 million students enrolled in a college class nationally. You see what's growing and what's shrinking. So the two numbers that are circled, 4% growth year over year. It's just 1 year, year-over-year growth, 4% growth in students who are only enrolled in an online program, 6% growth of students who are enrolled in a mix, some brick and mortar, some online, and students who are only enrolled in brick and mortar is declining by 3%. And then you look at just private colleges, so this is the business Hope is in, and you see basically the same trend, although online only is growing even faster at 8%, mix, online and brick and mortar is growing at 6%, and no online is declining by 2%. So this just shows that we're under pressure. There's more competitors. And again, it says, people have said, well, online isn't real. I don't think online is a very good education. I don't. But the problem is they're stealing our students now, so we have to pay attention. And the other thing that's happened is there's been this huge explosion of vocational schools. And maybe you've read about these coding boot camps. These are really popular on the West Coast now. So what a student will do, a student will graduate high school and they'll sign up for a 10 or 12-month coding boot camp, and they'll learn how to code. And then they will get a great job working at Facebook or Google or Amazon, and they'll be paid pretty well, but they'll only know one thing. They know how to code. And that creates two problems, I think. One is that we lose out on an educated citizenry, and to the extent education is a public good, which I think it is, we lose out on that. And two, I'm not convinced that those coding jobs will even exist, or at least exist the way they exist now 10 or 15 years from now, which means those students will somehow have to be retrained. So but nevertheless, you see the trend. These coding boot camps are exploding in growth. And then the other thing, and I know you know all this, but the Midwest in particular is under a lot of demographic pressure. So not only is there more competition, but the population of students is declining. So that creates a lot of challenges for us long term. And then the question is, what can we do about it? Before we go into the future, I want to take a quick step back. Some of you know this. For the first 54 years of Hope's existence, we were fully funded. By the way, I've never said the words free tuition. People put that in my mouth. I've never once said the words free tuition, because it's never going to be free. It's never going to be free. The question is, who should pay for it? A Hope education is and always will be very expensive. The question is, who should pay for it? And for the first 54 years of our existence, we were fully funded. We were fully funded by the RCA Church. We started charging tuition for the first time in 1920. The price then was $35 per student per year. If you adjust that for inflation, that would be a little over $430 today. And today we're at $46,000. So we beat inflation. Congratulations. This just shows the price today. 20 years ago when I was a student, I had to dig through my old yearbooks to find that picture. 20 years ago when I was a student, the full price tuition, room, and board was $20,000, which means in 2 decades it's more than doubled. And if you continue the same trend 10 years from now, when our oldest daughter, Sophie, will be a student at Hope, the price will be $65,000, which means in one generation, the cost of Hope College has more than tripled. It's crazy, and it's not sustainable. So then the question is, what can we do about this? Again, this might be too technical for some of you, but what I want to show here is that, going back to my point on keeping costs contained really moves the needle long term. So Hope, if you project out, what we're projecting for budget growth is 2.5% every year for perpetuity. If you contain that growth to 1.5%, so we're still growing, we're not in cost-cutting mode, we're still growing the budget, but we're growing at a slower rate. We're growing at 1.5% rather than 2.5%. And I think we can do that and still pay 3% salary increases. And I want to do that, and I want to do that for a couple of reasons. One is that I want morale to be really high when we're going through some big ambitions together. Two is that U.S. News and World Report looks at faculty salary, and Hope is below the median. We're below the national median, and so I want to catch up to at least where the median is, if not beat the median. Because I think that's the right thing to do. You pay for what you get, and if we want world-class talent, I think that means we have to pay world-class salaries. Also, it helps our ranking, and our ranking could be a lot better. We're 105, and so I want our ranking to be a lot better. So I want to pay better salaries, but I also want to keep the budget growth contained to 1.5%. And the impact of doing that, the impact of containing the budget growing to 1.5% rather than 2%, over long periods of time, like 10 years, makes a huge difference. So you can't read this, but it doesn't matter, because I'll tell you what you need to know. What you need to know is that if we simply contained budget growth to 1.5% rather than 2.5% growth, over 10 years from now, the college would need $17 million of less revenue than we're currently projecting. 17 million divided by 3,000 students is $5,500 per student of less tuition revenue that we would have to charge 10 years from now than we're currently projecting. And that's still growing the budget. It's just growing the budget at a slower rate. And so this cost containment thing is real. It really moves the needle. And this is something that we're talking about a lot as a team, and that I'm starting to talk about a lot internally at Hope, because it really moves the needle. Then the question is, what if we contained expense growth and aggressively grew the endowment? And this is where it really gets exciting. So if you contained expense growth and over 5 years, if you could raise $100 million for the endowment, you could basically keep tuition flat in perpetuity, at least for 15 years, maybe longer. It depends kind of what your projections are for budget growth, but you could at least do a 10 to 15 year flat tuition. And then you can say, let's have a really big God-sized dream and let's get really exciting. What if you were able to raise a dramatic amount of money, and if you were able to raise over $1 billion over 10 years, you could get to the point where we could go back to the beginning and fully fund tuition again. And what's cool about that is that would give us a lot of options. I'm not saying we would want to make it fully funded for everybody. We could. In some ways, I kind of like the equity of that. But we would have a lot of options. We would have a lot of things to think about. A lot of the elite Ivy League schools are already doing this. Nobody's tried it yet with a school our size, but the elite Ivy League schools are already doing this. So Harvard has this sort of tiered pricing model where if you make under $160,000 of family income, you don't pay anything. Rice University just announced, and I think they did use the vernacular free tuition. They just announced free tuition for families who make under $120,000. So some places have said, well, for people who can afford, for people who are at the upper crust, we might as well continue to charge them. So let's do that, but let's make it fully funded for everyone else. So we could have a lot of options. There's a lot of different flavors for what fully funded could look like. But I'm excited about the big ambition, and what I'm trying to get the institution excited about is that, the big ambition. Before we get bogged down into the mire of the details, I just want us to have a sense of excitement for what this big ambition could mean for hope. And I've been talking about this a lot, and some people said, well, that's a great ambition. What's your plan? And right now, there's no plan. There's just not a plan. Eventually, we'll turn the ambition into a plan. But for now, I'm trying to get our college and our donors and our stakeholders excited about this big ambition. So in 1961, President Kennedy announced a national ambition to send a man to the moon and bring him home safely. And before he said that out loud, his own team was trying to convince him not to say it. His own team was saying, that's impossible. We'll never be able to pull that off. And the guy who was the head of NASA was saying, like, maybe we can send a guy to the moon, but we'll never get him home safely. He'll be stuck up there. And there's a Matt Damon movie, like, where he's stuck on Mars. It'd be like that. So, and yet, JFK said out loud, in 1961, he said out loud to a joint session of Congress and announced it as a national ambition. And later that same year, he said it at Rice University in front of a football stadium full of 40,000 people. He said it again. And what's interesting is that JFK was not a scientist. He had no idea how this was actually going to happen. And his own team was telling him it was impossible, and yet he kept saying it out loud. And what he did was he got the whole country excited about this big ambition, to the point where eventually the team at NASA said, holy cow, they're actually expecting us to pull this off. We better figure it out. And 8 years later, they did. And I'm at that stage. I'm at the stage where I'm trying to get our campus excited about thinking big, having God-sized ambitions for our God-centered school. And before we get mired down into the details, what would it mean? How would we do this? This is so complex. I just want to try to get us excited about having a big ambition. Because as you saw, this model is under so much pressure. So why not, instead of just kind of trying to survive through it, why not try to be a leader? Why not try to totally change the conversation? Why not try to totally do something dramatically different? The question is this kind of fundraise even possible for us? There, I think the answer is it's not impossible. If that makes sense. And so I highlight a couple of 3 or 4 things that I think are important to note here. The first is that, and you probably can't read all this, but there is some precedent for smaller schools doing outsized fundraising campaigns. One that I think is interesting is Claremont McKenna. They're smaller than us. Their student population is 1,300 students, and they raised over $600 million during the years of the financial crisis, which was a huge feat for them. So there is some precedent for small schools doing outsized fundraising campaigns. The second thing there is that I think Hope has an opportunity. We're leaving some money on the table simply because we have alumni who aren't fully engaged. Today it's the case that around 15% of our alumni give back to Hope College, and the schools that are best in class in alumni participation are way higher than that, 40%, 50%, 60%. And so I think we can just, there's money on the table simply in our own family, in our own network, that we can, I think, do a better job of getting if we just engage our alumni in a more effective way. And then the third thing is, and I might be totally naive here, but I happen to believe, and this is an instinct, I don't have real research or numbers to back me up here, but I happen to believe that it actually as counterintuitive as it sounds, I happen to believe that it will be easier to raise a big amount of money for a big dream than it will be to raise a small amount of money for a small dream. Because I think people want to be part of something that changes the world. I think people want to be part of something that's big and ambitious and cool. And I just think, in some ways, it also makes fundraising an exciting thing. To the extent people say, well, I don't know if you can pull that off. That sounds impossible. But if you can do it, I'd kind of like to be a part of it. And I think that sense is kind of worth tapping into. And so, again, I might be naive there, but I do think, in some ways, what's the downside? If we go after a big goal and we don't hit it, but we still raise a lot of money, there's not a lot of downside to talking about a big ambition. So that's kind of my mindset. And then, obviously, we're a God-centered school, and God says, with me, all things are possible. And so that's where I think, and I tend to get sort of theological here, but Jesus uses all these seed metaphors. He's always talking about planting seeds. The parable of the sower, he says faith like a mustard seed. He's always using these seed metaphors, which of course makes sense for them. They're an agrarian society. But I think what's cool about that is that when you plant a seed, and my mom grew up on a farm, so I have some sense of what the farming world is like. And there's nobody in the world who works harder than farmers. And yet the real work done on a farm, you plant seeds, and God controls all of that. It all happens magically underground. God does the work. God does the real work of a farmer. And my kids are at this stage where they ask these questions that are so pointed and simple, but they just make me feel like an idiot sometimes. And so I imagine, if I were to be plopped back to the life where my mom grew up, and all of a sudden I was a farmer, and my kid said, okay, Dad, what's your plan? How are you going to take care of us? And I would say, okay, kids, here's my plan. See these little kernels called seeds. I'm going to take these seeds, and I'm going to bury them. And then 150 days later, we're going to have food. And our kids would say, Dad, I don't think that's a good plan. Let's just go to Myers. And because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And yet that's what happens. God does all the work when you plant the seeds. So I'm talking to our donors and people who I think might get excited about this. And for now, all I'm doing is that. I'm planting seeds. I'm talking about this conversation. And I'm not even asking for money yet. What I've started doing is saying, I'd love for you to give me names of other people who you think might be excited about this, who you think might want to help change the world of higher education. But I'm not even asking for money yet. I'm just trying to get people excited about this big ambition. So that's that. Then I think I don't need to spend a lot of time here, but this just highlights some points about how this would change Hope College. And I think it's obvious, but there's so much about this that would be exciting. We could build the most interesting, vibrant, diverse class of 800 students that we could possibly imagine. It would put Hope College on the map in a way that it's not on the map today. And it would also show that we are a leader in, I would argue, one of the most important conversations that we're having in the world today. The whole world is trying to figure out, why has higher education gotten so expensive? What if it could be the case that this little school in this small corner of the world could actually figure it out? It just would be amazing. It would put this place on the map in a remarkable way. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. And I want to stop to go through some questions, but the next step is what I've been kind of teasing out is, if you want to give philanthropically to Hope, you sort of have three options. You can give to the annual fund, to a building, or to the endowment. And what I've been trying to show is the impact. So if you give to the annual fund, that's great, we're appreciative, but we spend it and then it's gone. If you give to a building, that's great, but buildings too come and go. We had a Nykirk building, we had a Van Raalte building, so buildings don't last forever. But if you give to the endowment, it does last forever. In fact, $1 given to the endowment, if you just double the life of the school, the total impact of every single dollar given to the endowment over the next 150 years is over $36. So it's 36 times your investment, whereas the other two ways of giving to the college have come and gone. The dollar's spent and the building is gone. So that's what I'm trying to build the case for to donors, and this just shows the impact of $10,000 in the endowment over the next 150 years of the school's life adds up to more than $350,000 of impact, which is cool. I think that's cool. If you want to talk to donors about leaving a legacy, why not do something like this and help us change higher education And the great news is, thanks to my predecessors, we do have great facilities. If we didn't have great facilities, we'd have to have a totally different conversation. But because we already have an amazing physical footprint, we can focus on this kind of conversation with our donors rather than, I skipped over this. So you decide. This is meant to be lighthearted. This is the old Snow Auditorium in Nykirk, which obviously is torn down now. So you decide where do you want your philanthropy to make the most impact. And then I think it's just a cool conversation that we can have, as I said, because we have amazing facilities like this, thanks to my predecessors. So we've got 15 minutes or a little more to have a conversation, and I'd love to hear what's on your mind. Hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of things I'm thinking about and the kind of things that we're working on as a leadership team. Yeah, thanks.
As we begin our questions, because I'm sure many of you have many, many questions, we are going to ask this morning that you just ask your most important question. And that will give other people the chance to answer questions. And I'll be on this side of the room, and Gary will be on the other side. Thank you.
How large is the endowment right now?
Thanks, good question. Would you mind saying your name for me?
Bill Van Dyke.
Thanks, Bill. Our endowment today is around $230 million. We throw around the endowment. By the way, one thing I've been talking to the team about is just rebranding the endowment. I think we should just give it a different name. You talk to donors about the endowment, you just kind of see them getting bored. And so I just want to call it something else. Like, let's call it the Hope Scholarship Fund or the Hope Access Fund or Change the World Fund or something. Something that just sounds more exciting than the endowment. But today our endowment is around $230 million. 85 million of that 230 is designated for scholarships. The rest of it is for other things. We have endowed professorships. Each building has its own endowment. So there's underneath the endowment is a lot of different small endowments. The one we need to focus on growing is the scholarship piece of it.
Whoops. 2 years ago, or two presidents ago,
Yeah.
John Knapp left, I think, earlier than he would have expected to otherwise because there were conflicts between himself and the board. You have been on the board before taking this on. How does that influence decision-making?
Thanks, that's a great question. So, thanks to John Knapp, I'm on the board. John put me on the board a few years ago, and I was honored to serve the school that way. And I traded emails with John after this announcement. I said, John, look what you did. It's been great. I think the good thing is that because I was on the board, and I joined after the drama with John, so I wasn't around for the dramatic moment, but I was around for the kind of the aftermath of it. I know the board pretty well and have a great relationship with the board, and I've gotten to know a lot of other new college presidents, and that is the stakeholder group that a lot of new college presidents have to invest a lot of time in getting to know the board. The good news for me is I have a great relationship with the board already, so I can invest my time in getting to know the faculty and getting to know other stakeholders. So I'll have to continue to invest in that relationship. I know that's the case, but for now I feel really good about my relationship with the board, and I can spend my time on other stakeholders. Yes, thank you.
Elaine Tanis speaking. Yes. You said Hope's ranking is 105. I trust that's national ranking, and who does that ranking?
So there's a lot of different rankings. The one that most people look at is the U.S. News and World Report ranking, and that's the ranking where we're 105 in the nation. Liberal arts schools, right? So they have different categories for different schools, and we're 105th for liberal arts. Liberal arts, I think, is what they call our category. I think we deserve a much higher ranking. I think the great news is our academic product is excellent, and the same ranking, U.S. News and World Report, ranks us 23rd in the nation for undergraduate research. We're tied with Swarthmore and Cornell for undergraduate research. So our academic offering is excellent. I think we could do a better job, but there's a game. To be honest, there's a game that institutions play around this ranking. And so I think we could do a better job of kind of playing the game and working to get our ranking a little bit higher. But I think the great news is that our product is excellent. I don't want to change the product. I want to change the way our product is funded, and I want to change how our product is recognized. But our product is world-class.
Lee Strabel.
Hi.
Diversity has come up several times in your talk today. Could you define what diversity looks like for Hope College in the future? We know there's been controversy in the past. We know there's been some disgruntled students. There's been a lot of disgruntled community members. What do you mean when you say Hope's diversity is going to be improved? How do you define that? What groups are we talking about? And where are we going?
Thank you. Such a great question. So to your point, there's a lot of ways you can define diversity. I'm focused on two very specific aspects of diversity for now, and then we can expand the conversation. But I think there's two areas where we just simply need to do better. One is geographic diversity. Today, Hope pulls 85% of our students from 5 states in the Midwest. And I just want us to be, a nationally recognized school, and we've become a regional school. And so I want us to be more of a national school. So that's the first thing, is just simply geographic diversity. The second thing is racial diversity. Hope, our student body today is 82.5% white. Our faculty population, faculty and staff, is close to 90% white. It's 88, 89% white. And so there, I just think that I view as problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that I think a more racially diverse environment is more vibrant, and it's a more interesting and fun learning environment. Two, I think that God cares about diversity a lot, and I want Hope to be a better reflection of God's kingdom than it is today. God's kingdom is not 82.5% white. And so there's a lot of ways you can define diversity, but for me, those are the two that I'm focused on for now.
I had a similar question. How does an organization, in this case Hope, but it applies to all organizations, what steps can be taken to achieve that goal of diversity, racial diversity, sexual preference diversity?
Yeah.
How can you've got a stable of great professors. How do you let some go to fill in others? And are they held to the exact same standard, which sometimes in itself prevents the diversity to search for?
Yeah. So thanks. It's a great question, and the honest answer is there is no answer. There's no one single thing that's a silver bullet here. I think culture is a very big piece of this, and that's why I'm so focused on this whole idea of health before growth and looking in the mirror and talking about our culture. What is it about our culture that's held us back? So I think there's a big piece of this conversation that's around our culture. And it's one thing to recruit students of color. It's a whole other thing for them to feel like they belong here. And I like the word belonging. The word belonging is a very biblical word. God says, it says in 1 John, you belong to God. And it doesn't say you belong to God if, it says you belong to God. And if you belong to God, you ought to belong at Hope College. So I like the word belonging, and I want to create that sense of belonging in our culture. I also think, and I don't have this is not a fully fleshed out, articulate thought yet, but I think vernacular is important. So the bigger question is, how do you create an inflection point? I mean, organizations change in two ways. You can make tiny incremental progress year by year, and then over a long span of time, you can see the progress. The other way organizations change is you create an inflection point. There's some moment, there's some spark, there's something that happens where the momentum changes. And the question is, how can we create an inflection point with regard to diversity? One thing I've been thinking about, and again, this is not a fully fleshed out, articulate thought, but one thing I've been thinking about is vernacular. And maybe the vernacular needs to change. Maybe diversity itself, maybe that word, maybe that phrase, maybe that's too tired, maybe it's too political, maybe it's too whatever. I've gotten to know a guy named Dan Porterfield. Dan was president of Franklin and Marshall for a long time, and he's now the president of the Aspen Institute. And when you look at their numbers, what they did with regard to diversity, specifically racial diversity, it's astronomical. They totally changed their campus in not a lot of time. And I asked Dan, I said, what did you do? And he said, the first thing I did is he said, I stopped using the word diversity. He said, you can Google me, and I never once used that word. And I said, wow, what'd you say? And he said, I talked about talent. And he said, that's the only word I ever used, talent. And then we would recruit talent broadly and diversely. And this gets to your point about lowering standards, which of course we don't want to do. And Dan's philosophy was nobody wanted to be at Franklin and Marshall because they were there as part of a diversity initiative. They wanted to be there because they were part of a talent initiative. I think that's powerful. I don't know what the equivalent. I guess we could just copy him. But I don't know what the equivalent of that is. And maybe there's a vernacular shift we could make. Maybe there's something we could do to change the conversation. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. Another thing I'm thinking about is just kind of alignment of programs. And if you look at, Hope is spending a decent amount of money on diversity programs now. There's one thing I've asked our CFO for is just an audit of all the money we're spending on diversity, broadly defined, scholarships, programs, centers, all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of money all over the place. I mean, it adds up to millions of dollars. And if you said, wow, we spend X million dollars on diversity, you feel like, wow, that should really move the needle. And yet maybe the problem is it's kind of all over the place, and it's sort of this patchwork thing where somebody says, I have an idea, let's try this new program, and they say, great, let's do it, and it's over here. And then somebody says, let's try another new program, and say, great, it's up here. And then you have kind of this scatter plot of programs, and maybe it's the case that you need just simply more alignment or a better structure. I have some instincts here, but I don't necessarily know if that's the right thing or not. Some people will argue it's actually better to have a scatter plot rather than to have it all isolated in one place under one person, which is not how Hope does it. Hope has this kind of scatter plot approach, which is more distributed. Some people will argue that's actually better. I'm just looking at, whatever we've been doing hasn't been working particularly well because the numbers have barely changed over the last decade. And so I'm just thinking about how do we create that inflection point where instead of tiny incremental progress, it goes up by a fraction of a % every year. How do we create a momentum shift?
Quick comment on this latest issue. If you take a look at our Phelps Scholars Program, which we established 20 years ago,
right.
That's one good model. What I wanted to say, though, is that with regard to endowment, when Gordon Van Wylen came in 1972, the endowment was about $2 million. When he left 15 years later, it was about $20 million. John Jacobson came in, and in 12 years, it went from 20 to 100 million. Mm-hmm. So under Van Wylen, tenfold, Jacobson, fivefold. So to get from where we are now to your goal, you have to get only fourfold. So it's manageable.
Amazing. Jack, thank you. I love that. That's such a great perspective. I'm going to take you on the road, Jack.
Doug Johnson.
There's one here, yeah.
A friend of mine is
yes.
Bob DeYoung, and he was a long time
yes.
involved with the college and stuff. And he says that relationships come first. He says, I never just ask for money. It's
yes.
always in a relationship. And I'm wondering, where is the program now in developing relationships, both small and large, that gets us to that end goal of the money that we're looking for?
Yeah, thanks. It's such a great point. And I do think Jeff is here. That's the mindset we have, that it's all about relationships first. And that's why I'm spending so much time simply meeting people. And as I said, I'm not asking for money now. I'm meeting people. I'm establishing a relationship. I'm hopefully starting to get them excited about the big ambition, but I'm not asking anybody for money now. I'm just establishing relationships. One cool thing about having a younger president, I just turned 40. This is amazing. The statistics on this are remarkable. The average age of a college president in the United States today is 62 years old. That's the average, which means a lot of them are older than that. I can do this job for 22 years and only be at the average age. So, so I can have a long-term mindset to this, and I can establish relationships with students who just graduated last year or 5 years ago who don't have any money now, but hopefully they will someday. And I can have a totally different kind of mindset to this because I can do this job for decades. I can build relationships that will last for decades with people who may not have resources now, but hopefully they will at some point in the future. And that's a different kind of thing. And I think that's where Hope is, I mean, you know this, but Hope has done something really different. And it's taken a lot of courage. And I'm so proud of Hope for having the guts to do something different. I'm honored to be the recipient of that courage. But naming a younger, non-academic president takes guts, real courage. And it's amazing. It's amazing what Hope has done. And so, yes, it does allow me to have a different kind of mindset to relationships. And what I'm hoping we can get to is that we can eventually get to a point where we create this cycle of generosity, where our students feel like Hope was generous to them, and so they, in turn, will be generous back. And that's a totally different mindset than what we have today. And I alluded to this briefly when we talked about students as customers. And unfortunately, that's what's been created in higher education, is a transactional relationship where students feel like they pay for something and then they move on. And why would I give Hope more money? I already gave them close to $200,000 over 4 years. And that's a transactional relationship. And if we can change that dynamic where students feel like Hope was great, Hope was generous to me, and I want to be generous back, then what that creates is that actually creates a sort of pay-it-forward model. So you move from a pay-as-you-go model to a pay-it-forward model. And that's, I think, would be a dramatic shift. And again, you only get there through establishing long-term relationships. Thanks for the question.
We're going to take one more question, and I think it's in the back there.
Yep.
Speaking of relationships, can you say just a little something about Hope's relationship with the city, and particularly how diverse students would feel welcome in Holland?
It's a great question, particularly here on Election Day. So I think the amazing thing is, the amazing thing, and Hope has so many things that make it special. One thing that makes Hope special is that we were founded, the city and the school were founded at the same time by the same person and grew up together. And so there's a very symbiotic relationship, and it's been that way for more than 150 years. And that's distinct, that's cool, and it makes our relationship with the city very powerful, very special. I think, the interesting thing, I was here as a student 20 years ago, and now I'm back, and Holland itself is dramatically more diverse than it was 20 years ago. And so the city's changing. And in some ways, I think the college hasn't kept pace with the changing diversity of the city, is my own observation. I actually haven't looked at the numbers, but my sense is the city's more diverse now than the school is. And so I think in some ways the school kind of has to catch up to where the city is. I think the good news is, the first point is, I think Hope has a great relationship with the city. I think it's cool to have a small school that's not out in the middle of nowhere. It's not separated from the rest of the city. Calvin's a great school, but they're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. At Hope, we have a school where students can walk to 8th Street, and 8th Street is a destination now. It was not the case 20 years ago that 8th Street was a destination. There was one place where we would go to hang out as students. It was JP's, on my first date at JP's. But now there's coffee shops all over the place. There's restaurants. There's a movie theater. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do on 8th Street now. And I think that's nice. It just creates a stronger relationship with the city. Because Hope benefits tremendously from the city of Holland, and I would hope, I think that the city feels the same way about having Hope in the city, that the city feels like Hope has benefited also from having Hope here. So I know sometimes there's always tension in those kind of relationships, but I feel like for the most part, as I've observed it, and again I'm 4 months into the job, I've observed a really strong symbiotic relationship between the city and the school.
President Scogin, we cannot thank you enough for giving us such good insight into your plans for the future.
Thank you.
And we do wish you a long tenure here at Hope College. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.